Hello, welcome to the WARC podcast, and thanks for joining us from our studio here in Cannes. My name's Amy Rodgers, and I'm head of content for WARC Creative. Well, what a week it's been already. Yesterday we had CMOs from Unilever, McDonald's and Molson Coors take to the stage as part of our Creative Impact programme, co-curated by WARC and Lions. And the rooms were also packed for a series of intimate masterclasses that we did with industry experts like Dr. Grace Kite and James Herman. But if you missed all of that, don't worry, we've got lots more coming up. On today's podcast, we'll hear all about yesterday's session on the triple opportunity of attention. We'll find out more about WARC's latest partnership with the B2B Institute, and also hear about what happened when Scott Galloway arrived at the French Riviera. But first, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Yusuf Chuku, who is EVP Client Strategy at NBCUniversal. Yusuf, welcome. How's your week been so far?
Good, but busy.
Yeah, but absolutely. Mine too. Very busy. Okay, we're going to talk today about some recent research into the importance of context in advertising. But why don't we just kick off with a bit about you and your role at NBCUniversal?
Yeah. So some context.
Yeah,
right.
some context. Yes. Exactly.
So my background, I'm an advertising strategist by trade. So I've always been in strategy. I was a media strategist, a comm strategist, a creative strategist. So all the flavors of strategy. And then about 2.5 years ago, I left my role as global chief strategy officer at VMLY&R, and I went over to 30 Rock, and I head up a research and insights team that sits in ad sales. But we are focused on understanding the relationship of our programming with audiences. We are looking at the broader context in which our advertising sits. So we're kind of looking at everything that's happening in the world. We are looking at how audiences are navigating a massively changing media ecosystem. And then the other piece, and the bit that I get like most excited about, I think probably, is that like I sat at creative agencies for many years, and I would tell clients that like we could help them like navigate culture and help them tap into culture. And then I arrive at NBCUniversal, and I suddenly realize I'm sat at a company that does that every minute of every day. And so in the process of creating movies, TV, experiences at the theme parks, we are gaining so much knowledge of like the world and culture.
Yeah.
And so I there's nothing I love more than like going into these nooks and crannies of our organization and finding the insight that we are picking up just by virtue of doing what we do, and then packaging that up and taking that out to advertisers, agencies as just insight into kind of culture and people.
Absolutely. That's fascinating. That's exactly what we've had so much talk this week about, brands trying to tap into culture. And that's, this objective on so many case studies that we read, we're trying to tap into culture, and you have so many insights on that, your role. So yeah, fascinating. So let's dive into the research. It's all about context and the emotional connection with brands when you get content in the right context. So obviously you think context matters. Tell us a bit about why and what motivated you to carry out the study.
So it starts at a very personal place. Like when I came into the industry, I had to kind of make a choice as to kind of what flavor of strategy I wanted to be in. So I could either go into account planning and focus on creative messaging, or I could go into media and think about where the advertising lives. I went into media initially just because of I felt that just like understanding kind of what was happening in the world, and importantly, like it was early stages of the internet, and so like it just seemed like an exciting space. But I was continuously frustrated about not being able to think about the content and the context together. Like we forced ourselves to kind of think about them separately. And then on top of that, I've always been a little frustrated about how we conceptually think about how advertising works. And so we kind of go, there is I entered an industry where we kind of go, there's a consumer, and then there's a brand. And messaging just travels through this vacuum straight into a consumer's head. Yeah. And the reality is that's not the case. Like there's context, there's stuff just happening in the world. There are things that audiences are interested in that just doesn't happen to be that brand's message at that point in time.
Yeah.
And so when we think about content messaging, we have to think about the context, because the context literally has a direct impact on what you do. So what I've been pushing for, what we have been working on as a team at NBCUniversal is helping advertisers really understand the context more in order to inform the content. And so just thinking about both at the same time.
Yeah, I was lucky enough this week to sit in on some of the creative effectiveness category judging, and that actually came up quite a lot. I was really encouraged to hear the conversation around, the metrics that were coming out of these case studies and the work that had been done. They wanted more of the context. They were like, but hang on, what was going on at the same time in that country, or, what was the sentiment in consumers in that region at the time? And they talked about context a lot. So, definitely to what you're talking about. So tell us a bit more about the study that you did.
Yeah, so there are kind of two elements to the research. So we first of all wanted to understand the nature of the relationship between audiences and our content. I think we have all, as an industry, everyone would have known that like there is something very special around TV content, but we've kind of just gone, it's sort of magic, like, and just left it at that. It's like people love it, but like we can't dig any further. But that idea of love for the content is something that we really wanted to kind of unpack. And so we worked with a company called Coherency, that have an approach which is called the love quotient. It's based on relationship science, and so actually it picks up on an algorithm that I think it was used by eHarmony, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but like the algorithm kind of basically works through matching.
Okay, interesting.
And so you kind of go, how do you take that same approach when you think about TV content, media brands, and the love that consumers have for it? So we kind of ventured into understanding that relationship. And then on top of that, we then wanted to dig a little bit further into emotion, because obviously it's love. There is something happening emotionally in there. We, as an industry, like really have started to understand the importance or the power of emotion when it comes to advertising.
Absolutely.
And so we wanted to think about emotion not through the messaging piece, but actually the context. And so kind of what kind of emotion is being driven by the content, the programs, and then what impact does that have, therefore, on the advertising that sits within it? And so we worked with a company called MediaProbe out of Portugal. They have been doing a lot of work that's based around understanding kind of people's emotional reaction. And so I nerd out over the methodology behind MediaProbe's work.
Yeah.
But what we, and I'll sort of get into it, but what we, this kind of work used to happen in a lab. And so we could only look at like one show amongst a limited number of people in a limited time frame, and not in their home environment.
Okay, so you had bring people into a lab,
so
into
normally
a
you'd
sterile
bring them
environment.
in and you'd like,
okay,
yeah.
interesting.
And so what we were able to do with MediaProbe is essentially take it out of the lab,
Put it into their context.
put it into their homes, in
Yeah,
their context,
okay.
and do it at scale. And there's sort of three aspects to the methodology, and I kind of think about it in the same way that like a GPS satellite works. You need like at least three, if not four, if you want to add time on. So like between those, you can triangulate where a vehicle is. And for us in this research, the same was true of emotion. And so the three aspects are essentially we want to understand what people feel, what they think, and what they ultimately say. And so for the feel piece, in people's homes, there is a sensor that sits on their palm, and it measures a galvanic skin response. So it's their physiology.
Amazing.
And so what we know is that when you have an emotional response to something, like literally it manifests in the sweat.
It's a physical response.
It's a physical response. So the sensor is able to pick it up. And so we now know what they feel. Then we want to pick up what they think. And so at the same time, in a kind of dial test essentially, but this time it sits on their phone. And so as they are having that emotion, they're then able to kind of register it, like I'm feeling this mentally on their phone. So that's the second piece, what they're thinking. And then what they're saying, we captured in a survey after they've watched the show. So we are then basically tracking their emotion all the way through the show, through the ad break, back into the show. And we have this at scale, so like thousands of consumers or audiences. We have it across a ton of our shows. We've been doing it over the last few years. So we kind of now have this rich database of people's emotional response to the advertising.
That's fascinating and super scientific. I didn't realize there was so much kind of data from multiple different sources and multiple different aspects of looking at it. So amazing. So tell us about the findings. What did you find out? Did it work?
Drum roll. So what I love is this is an ongoing piece of research. So we there are a ton of initial findings, but there's also what I get really excited about is what we then can go on to discover as we break it down by different groups. So we kind of a separate thing about kind of Hispanics watching football, and so we kind of like have done a whole lot of stuff on the World Cup and all that sort of stuff. But for this piece, one of the initial things that we discovered, and it's funny, the strategist in me was initially skeptical until I sort of delved into it. But actually, there is genuinely an increased level of love, and this came from the coherency work, for our media brands versus others. On average, it's about 19% higher for NBCU media brands than it is for others. And you only, it's when you look at some of the things that live there that you kind of understand it, whether it's kind of driven by the fandom of Bravo. Some of the sports content are kind of late night programming. All of it is kind of generating this greater brand love. Then it was interesting when you then dig into some of the work that came out of Media Probe. We found, and this is probably the biggest a bit like aha for me, is that we found that actually the ad break, the advertising that sat within the content was nearly as engaging as the content itself, and very close. So it's actually 98% as engaging as the content.
Wow.
And so exactly, that was my response. And so it is, and when you think about it, like it actually makes sense, because I think when we normally kind of assume that like that you're watching the show, ad break comes on, I'm gonna go make a cup of tea.
Yeah.
And so we've always gone, well, they turn off and then they'll come back again. And so we kind of have gone like that first in break and that last in break became like the premium positions. But because we're dealing with emotion, people can't turn off their emotions. Like you don't suddenly go, emotion's gone.
I'm out.
So like it actually carries on. And so therefore what happens is that if you think about that emotion running through the ad break, it's there, the first spot, second, third, like they're still feeling emotional. So it carries on from the show. And what that means is as an advertiser, as you start to, I think there's something like 80% of sort of brand preference consideration is driven by emotion. So now if you're as an advertiser going, I'm looking at premium content that's driving emotion, I have an audience now that is primed emotionally for messaging. And so then you couple that with your advertising that is emotional and drives them in and then delivers at the same time can deliver a very rational sales message. It's perfect. And so what we are now looking at is how can you start to think about kind of the messaging in that context, that emotional context, like what kind of messaging is best there? How do you kind of capitalize on that emotion? And actually what kind of emotion is it? And so we're seeing whether it's the difference in some of the sport sort of emotion or what's happening in say comedy, which is again a different type of emotional response. That there is real opportunities for messaging for advertisers within that.
So you're working with brands then to kind of guide them and on which context their advertising best sits based on the emotion that they already have in that program.
That's exactly it. And I think if anything, for me, the biggest takeout, and it pushes back against, I think, something that the industry has been guilty of over the last few years, which is assuming that every impression is the same. And so we have got to this place where, as we think about planning advertising, we kind of go, all right, forget the creative, don't worry about that. It's all the same. Forget where it's going to live. It doesn't matter. What an impression is impression. As long as they see it, it doesn't matter. And I'm like, no, it does matter. There is a difference between seeing advertising that sits in a cat video, streamed somewhere, versus actually watching it in a show that you love.
Yeah.
Like that level of engagement, that level of emotional engagement is different. And when you find those environments that are high in emotion, we know that the advertising is going to be more effective. And so just thinking about the context is kind of all that I now ask of people as they run their advertising.
Brilliant. Fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us today, Yusuf.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
My next guest in the studio today is Alex Brownsell, Head of Content for WARC Media. Alex is here to tell us about yesterday's session on the triple opportunity of attention, which was presented by System One's Orlando Wood, Amplified Intelligence's CEO Karen Nelson-Field, and marketing consultant Rob Britton. Welcome, Alex. How's your week going so far?
It's good. It's been super busy, and I've been trying to get to a few sessions that have been covering attention, because it definitely has felt like at certain points of the festival it's been a really buzzy topic, and much more so than last year, where we kind of brought the attention agenda to Cannes for the first time.
It's good to hear it's continued the momentum into this year.
Definitely.
Okay, yesterday's session. Tell us what the research was about.
Okay, to rewind 12 months, we had Karen, Orlando and Peter Field on stage talking about the triple jeopardy of attention.
Yes.
And it was quite a sort of stark warning to the industry that the industry was over-investing in performance-driven, low attention media, and using creative that was narrow beam rather than broad beam, and therefore less likely to sort of build brands and emotionally resonate with audiences. And I think perhaps there was a feeling that left a sort of, it was quite a gloomy session in many ways. So I feel like the guys went away and thought, well, let's spin that on its head. Let's actually look at what the opportunities are here for brands to use those same, I guess, challenges, but to be more effective.
Yeah, let's make it a positive.
Yeah, no, exactly, and that's exactly it. So it was the title was changed from Triple Jeopardy to Triple Opportunity. Peter couldn't make it this year, but we had Rob Britton, as you mentioned, and they took us through some new research which showed that within the confines, the challenges of attention and attention limitations, there are opportunities for brands to do better, more effective work.
So how does it move on the debate from last year? Obviously, we talked about it turning from a bit of a gloomy subject to an opportunity. But what was the research, and how did it move the debate on this year?
So it moved it on, I think, subtly. There were some amazing stats, and it was a really great presentation. The fundamentals don't change, and to coin the phrase that Karen used, which is the sort of famous chicken or the egg. She's like, the egg comes first, and the egg is media. And for these guys, media is the number one consideration in attention. Creative can help, but within the confines. So the phrase that Karen used is attention elasticity. So any platform and channel has an upper and lower limit that attention can't better. You can have the best creative in the world. If you're using a low attention channel, you can't get any better than that. But what they then did is obviously look, okay, well, what can we do within those confines then? And that's where creative actually comes into it. So there was an interesting stat that sort of, that kind of high impact, high emotion, creative advertising on a high attention media platform can then boost viewing by about 18%.
Okay, good stat. Yeah, we've just had Yusuf on talking about how the context of the media placement of where something is really, really important for driving emotion and, driving the effectiveness of that ad placement. So yeah, it's an interesting continuation on that kind of attention piece. I guess you talked a little bit about creativity. How much does creativity come in? Did they talk about creativity much yesterday, or was it all kind of focused on the media and actually the creative side of things?
There was some kind of creative. I mean, I think there was probably consciousness that they were in Cannes and they wanted to sort of address this kind of topic. Orlando Wood at System One obviously was bringing a lot of the research that he's done that looks at the importance of broad beam advertising, the kind of creative devices and cues that are going to sort of resonate with the right brain, not the left brain. Mm-hmm. I hope I got that the right way around. He's written two fabulous books on this that really expand it more. So it was kind of adding that context. But I think that it's actually been interesting this year that creative and the importance or the role of creative within attention seems to be being explored a little bit. So I popped yesterday onto the PwC yacht.
Ooh, lovely.
You've got to
Swanky.
Exactly, you've got to head up the yachts. And they had a really interesting panel debate with Mike Follett from Lumen, and Mike, to be fair to him, had allowed PwC to audit his attention data, which I imagine was quite a scary thing to do because, that's his business.
Yeah.
But what he was able to what they were able to show is that Lumen is able to accurately predict attention levels 70% of the time, or 70% accuracy. And that's modeled, that's statistical, averages for different channels and platforms. The point is then, if you flip that on its head, that 30%, that's where creative comes in, because obviously, and they tested loads and loads of campaigns. The better ones are going to maximize that 30% opportunity. The bad creative isn't going to achieve that. So we're starting to kind of carve out and work out where creative sits in the whole attention thing. And I think it's really important because around the festival this year, there's been a lot more discussion about attention on the ad tech yachts, in some of the sort of places we mightn't have thought about. And it feels like attention's moving from the sort of rarefied academic pursuit to something that's actually much more happening, and it's happening in the industry in a much more active way.
Yeah, and that's why it's been talked about at a creative festival. If attention is the egg, and you can pull a lever of creativity on top of that to kind of maximize that attention, then it definitely deserves being talked about. Are you seeing attention talked about anywhere else at Cannes? Have you seen any other really interesting sessions apart from that Lumen one that you spoke about?
It crops up. I mean, I've seen various clients, leaders, agency leaders, and it's now cropping up regularly, and particularly in the context of measurement, because measurement is really hot topic. It's a challenge. Cross-media measurement is really tough and doesn't seem to be getting any easier. But attention is a new insight into effectiveness. So I think a lot of agencies are really, kind of focusing on it, and a lot of clients are focusing on it as well. So it feels like it's being talked about a lot more, and it's quite hardcore as a subject. And at a festival of creativity where people are here to look at the work and the output, there's a danger it can be quite dry, but I think the fact that it is being talked about shows. Yeah,
and those sessions are being attended, which is an encouraging sign. People are interested in it. It's being worked on. So, okay, brilliant. Thank you, Alex. It's been great having you here today, and enjoy the rest of your week.
I will do. Thank you.
My final guest today is Imaad Ahmed, who is Head of Advisory for EMEA and Americas at WARC. Imaad's been really closely involved with a new white paper that we've launched in partnership with the B2B Institute, which we'll talk about today, as well as a really interesting session that Imaad caught this week. So welcome to the podcast. How's your week been so far?
Hey, Amy. Yeah, so it's been busy. I suppose that's always the way, right, with Cannes. But great week so far. Great.
Everyone's tired. Everyone's had a long week, but busy is the key word. Okay, why don't we kick off with an intro to the white paper? Tell us what it's about.
Sure, yeah. So it's about something called the promise to the customer. It's a new mentor model, and the origin of it really was that it was developed by Roger Martin, who is a CEO, advisor, strategy expert, and the B2B Institute. And it all started really with a language problem that marketing has around things like brand and brand building, which are terms that we all use, but use quite liberally. And what that means is that when we go outside of the walls of marketing, those terms are less well understood, and therefore trying to communicate and articulate marketing's value becomes more difficult. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to test this idea of a promise to the customer, so an exclusive commitment to the customer, which is memorable, it's valuable, and it's deliverable. So think of something like Snickers, and Snickers satisfies, you're not you when you're hungry and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. We wanted to put those kinds of campaigns to the test to see if they're actually more effective than campaigns that didn't have a promise to the customer.
Okay, great. So how did you go about it? How did this test work?
Yeah, how long have you got? So so it was quite a long, complicated task. But as you'll know, kind of WARC for decades now have been collecting case studies on effectiveness. We've got thousands and thousands of them. And we tag them and we index them. We collect all the information as well around kind of the different effectiveness metrics that they are able to report on. These are all case study entries into awards. So the bar is really high when it comes to creative excellence, effectiveness, and so on. And so what we did is we went back to our definition of promise to the customer and those three components, so memorable, valuable, deliverable, and we identified a set of 2,000 case studies that were valid for analysis from like the last 5 years. 800 of those had a promise to the customer at the heart of them. And so we compared those 800 to the other 1,200 campaigns to see how they would perform on some of those typical metrics that a campaign would look to achieve.
Wow, amazing. A lot of work. How long has it taken? What's the build-up been to the publication of this?
It started back in November,
right.
So a labour of love,
definitely.
It's fair to say. Thankfully, otherwise, it could have been pretty depressed halfway through. But thankfully as well, like the results that came out are really, really like striking, and we think will really help marketers articulate the value of what they do, but also can, at a more downstream level as well, can make their campaigns more effective.
Okay, so hit us. What are the key findings?
So what we wanted to do is we wanted to look at kind of three main questions, right? We wanted to look at, do promise to the customer campaigns deliver any kind of brand building advantage? That was number one. Do they have any effect on market share or market penetration? So kind of more commercial style effects. And then thirdly, we wanted to look at if they had any influence on long-term brand and sales effects. So going through each of those in turn, and again, as I mentioned, looking at kind of frequency of reported metrics, that's how we analyse this stuff. With brand building, we looked at the impact on increase in brand health measures. So things like, brand consideration, preference, purchase intent, that kind of stuff. And what we found was that promise to the customer campaigns are 48% more likely to drive improvements in brand health measures than non-promise to the customer campaign. So that was already we were all pretty pleased with ourselves.
Yeah, great start.
A great start to the findings. But when we looked at it, we wanted to control for the size of a campaign and the campaign dynamics. Because, you could say, well, if the campaign has lots of budget, if it runs for a long time, then maybe it's going to be effective anyway, right? So we used something called creative equipment, which we launched a few years ago. Composite metric made up of budget, duration, a number of media channels that a campaign runs over. And we wanted to compare for impact on brand health measures, how promise to the customer would do versus non-promise to the customer at all levels of creative equipment. So whether you're like a really small brand with little budgets, little duration, or you're one of the bigger players with maximum budget, maximum duration, and run over lots of different channels. And what we found was that promise to the customer campaigns not only overperformed versus non-promise at every level of creative commitment, but actually like the biggest gap was at the lower levels of creative commitment, which is really exciting. If you think of like a brand with limited resources or a scale-up brand, the fact they could kind of even up an unfair playing field to match their rivals with a promise to the customer was really exciting. So that was brand advantage. The second one, on market share and penetration, similar kind of method to it. We found that promise to the customer over-indexed by 60% on being able to report market share increases and 17% on market penetration increases versus non-promise. And then finally, we looked at long-term brand and sales effects. And so for that, we used the creative effectiveness ladder, which we launched a few years ago. So a hierarchy of the 6 main types of effects that creative marketing can produce. So you've got your influential idea at the lowest level, the least commercially impactful, still effective, but kind of over a shorter period of time, all the way up to your enduring icon. So that's kind of long-term sales, sustained impact and brand growth. And we wanted to compare the relative distribution of, sorry to get a bit geeky, but the relative distribution of promise to the customer versus non-promise to the customer at each level of this ascending ladder. And what we found was that as you climbed the ladder, you were more likely to climb the ladder and succeed if you had a promise to the customer at the heart of your campaign, to the extent that at the very top of the ladder, the enduring icon, the relative proportions were 67% in favour of promise to the customer and 33% in favour of non-promise to the customer. So a marked difference. And as I said, that difference only increased as we went up the ladder. So really interesting findings.
Yeah, really interesting that we've kind of found there's another lever that you can pull, because you were talking about creative commitment there, and we tell people that, you've got 3 levers of budget, duration, and number of media channels that you can pull to boost your effectiveness. But then we're effectively saying here, you've got another one. If you include a promise to the customer in your campaigns, then you're more likely to climb that ladder and get those commercial gains. So yeah, super interesting. A lot in there. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack. Can you give us a summary, what are the 3 main things that you can take away from the report?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first one is starting right at the beginning, this idea that it helps marketers move from kind of complexity around brand and brand building a language to something more simple, to articulate it not only upstream amongst kind of the C-suite of a business and upstream strategy, but also downstream as to how you execute the campaigns. Secondly, we saw just now all the findings, all the different advantages: brand advantage, commercial advantage, long-term advantage. But then the third finding, which for me was actually the most interesting, was that this is a really good opportunity for smaller brands with more limited resources to, if they have a promise to the customer at the heart of their campaign, to actually match their bigger rivals. And that's what we saw when we looked at the different levels of creative commitment and analyze them against promise to the customer versus non-promise to the customer.
Awesome. Brilliant summary. Thank you. Okay, so that's the white paper. You also watched Scott Galloway's session earlier in the week alongside Doug Martin and Melissa Wildermuth of General Mills, talking about creative risk-taking, which is quite a different take on brand. Tell us a bit about that session.
Yeah, so we've just talked all about kind of brand and brand building, promises to the customer. Kind of the most striking thing about Scott Galloway's session with General Mills was that, and it was a bit of a mic drop moment. He talked about how the era of brand is over, right? And so, if you can imagine the Debussy, kind of thousands of marketers thinking, what's going on here?
What is he talking about? Yeah.
As I said, real mic drop moment. But it was really interesting because he kind of came at it from 2 different directions, right? The first direction is that if you're going to have brand-based advertising, the brands, the bigger brands who can afford it, and you don't actually need to have bigger budgets to afford it, but those brands need to be really committed to it over the long term. And some of those bigger brands are just losing the patience, the endurance, I suppose, to make that long-term commitment and keep to it.
Yeah.
The second thing from a more consumer perspective is that, if you and I think about like all the ad-free streaming platforms that we can use, or the ad blocking tools that we've got access to, we as consumers just don't actually have to watch advertising as much as we may have used to have to watch it, right? And so I think he was coming from that angle as well. And he used Apple as a great example. If you look at kind of Apple a few years ago, they had loads of great brand-based advertising, not that much talk about products and features and so on, which is kind of surprising if you think they're a tech brand where products and product specs and features are,
is their thing.
Exactly. And now they've pivoted to more product-focused ads. So that was kind of his example of showing this shift away from brand-based advertising.
Yeah, really, really interesting. Anything else that you took away from the session?
Yeah, the other thing, again, another mic drop moment from Scott Galloway. So this is something he's said before, but always entertaining, kind of always thought provoking. He talked about advertising as a tax on the poor and the technologically illiterate.
Okay.
As I said, he has said it before, but it's always kind of striking.
Yeah.
And again, I suppose it goes back to this idea of we're just not watching as many ads as we used to, because we don't have to watch as many ads as we might have done before this era of ad blocking tech and ad-free streaming platforms that we now spend a lot of time consuming. But I just thought it was really interesting to see that, because he kind of capped off that section by saying, if in this day and age you're watching ads, then basically your life hasn't turned out as you would have hoped for it to, which I know cued lots of laughter, but probably a bit of self-reflection, a bit of self-realization for a few of us in the room as well. But no, kind of a really kind of striking point to take away with us.
A really interesting perspective, definitely. I've never thought about it that way, but yeah, super interesting. Well, thank you very much, Imaad.
Cheers, Amy. Thanks very much.
So thanks to all our guests today. Thanks to Imaad, thanks to Yusuf and Alex, and thank you all for listening. We'll be back tomorrow here in the WARC podcast studio for our final daily show from Cannes Lions. So tune in for a debrief on all the key insights from our creative impact sessions, including some new research from James Herman on the importance of brand strength in e-commerce. And we'll be sharing key insights from CMO discussions throughout the week. And we'll also bring you all the news from this year's Future of Strategy debate on the question, is popular culture dead? So make sure you don't miss an episode of our Cannes specials or of our regular WARC podcast by subscribing on your favourite podcasting platform. And for those listening, you can watch all our daily Cannes episodes on YouTube and at warc.com. So until tomorrow, thanks for listening.